Hello, class, and welcome to the second part of our lecture for this week. In the first part, we took a look at the somatosensory system. Within this part of the lecture, though, we will narrow in more in the realm of biopsychology to two particular areas. One is agnosia, and specifically we will deal with tactile agnosia as well as ataxia. And I'm going to dive into this and just kind of explore a little bit of what we mean by agnosia. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of cover a little bit of a researcher that has kind of delved into the field of neural pathways and structures that underlie our ability to recognize sensory information from our bodies. We'll then dive in a little bit to agnosia and then into ataxia and look at some of the potential causes, because the difference between agnosia and ataxia really kind of highlights some of the different systems that are taking place in our embodied experience. So as we begin, I want to introduce you to Antonio Damasio, who is currently the chair of the neuroscience department and as well as professor of psychology at the University of Southern California. Now, as we take a look at agnosia, we can kind of recognize that Dr. Antonio Damasio has something to say about this field because he has focused in very much on the intricate neural networks that underlie perception. But his field of expertise is a little bit interesting in that it looks at emotion and decision-making as well. And so he has some groundbreaking work in the fields of brain lesions and how they provide profound insights into how disruptions in the networks can lead to things like agnosia. Now, one of Dr. Damasio's most influential books is something titled Descartes Error, where he really kind of challenges the traditional separation of emotion and cognition and argues that, in fact, there are some crucial somatic markers, that is, bodily sensations, that accompany emotions, and these help us in guiding our decision-making. And this perspective has reshaped our understanding of how the somatosensory system influences our everyday choices. And in the context of agnosia, Dr. Damasio's work shed light on how these conditions can disrupt not only sensory perception, but also the emotional and cognitive processes that are intertwined within it. And his research has emphasized the importance of considering the holistic nature of the brain and how it interacts with sensory information to shape our perception of the world, and how our subjective sense of ourselves and our bodies really goes a long ways in kind of defining how we live our lives. So in the somatic marker ideas, he really kind of posited the idea that these bodily senses of self are related to our emotions, and as such, they're a huge part of our subjective guide in the kinds of decisions that we make. By attaching the somatic, the bodily markers, to certain situations or stimuli. And these markers are bodily sensations that are associated with emotional states, for example. So, for example, a feeling of unease, which is a somatic marker, may be linked to a specific situation or choice that has previously led to negative outcomes. And one of the key contributions of Damasio's research is the idea that patients with damage to an area of the prefrontal cortex called the ventromedial cortex have inhibited impaired decision-making abilities and inability to generate appropriate emotional responses to various scenarios. And they have often make poor choices despite having relatively intact cognitive functioning. And this highlights the crucial role of emotional decision making. And so there is this really kind of underscores that there is this interconnectedness of sensory perception, as well as our emotional processing and our cognition that plays into this. So, for example, when your somatosensory system is compromised, say in the case of agnosia, the emotional markers associated with sensory experiences may be disrupted, leading to errors in recognizing or responding to stimuli, making bad choices in a sense. So, let's take a little bit of time and delve into the fundamental systems involved in somatosensory agnosia. Understanding these systems, I think, is crucial for us to grasp how disruptions in sensory perceptions can lead to disorders like agnosia. So the somatosensory system, as we've kind of reviewed a little bit already in the previous part of our lecture, is responsible for the tactile, proprioceptive, that is our awareness of position, and nociceptive, which is pain, information. And it comprises a real complex network of neural pathways, beginning from the sensory receptors in our skin and our muscles and our joints, and bringing that information into our spinal cord where there's some processing, then to our brainstem, and eventually reaching through our thalamus into the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. And so damage or malfunction at any point along these pathways can disrupt sensory perception. And particularly what's important here is the parietal lobe, especially the post-central gyrus, which plays a central role in processing the somatosensory information and helping us to develop a bit of a visual map of what it is we're interacting with. And it's here that the brain creates a detailed map of the body sensory input, known as that somatosensory homunculus. So this map allows us to perceive and recognize tactile sensations and is really vital for our spatial awareness and our coordination. And so sensory information doesn't exist in isolation. The brain integrates it with input from other sensory modalities like our vision and proprioception. And this integration then is crucial in forming a coherent perception of the world around us. And as Dr. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis highlights, it also helps and interacts with our emotional processing, and that helps in our decision-making regions of the brain. So, it helps us not only to understand the world around us, but to interact with that world. And it guides us in many ways. Now, I want to kind of delve a little deeper into agnosia. What is agnosia? And what are the different types of agnosia? What are we going to be focusing on here? So agnosia really refers to a whole family of disorders characterized by an inability to recognize or interpret sensory stimuli accurately. So despite having intact sensory pathways, you simply can't interpret the meaning of the information that's being sent to your brain. And these conditions really shed light on how there's that intricate interconnection and specialized workings of the brain, and that fine line that there is between perception and recognition. So one of the most common and well-known types of agnosia is visual object agnosia. And this is where individuals can see objects, but they really kind of struggle to recognize them. For instance, they may look at a common object like a cup or a pen and be unable to identify what it is, even though they know how to use it. There's also auditory agnosia, and that affects the recognition of sounds. So individuals with this condition can hear sounds, and they can hear speech, but they cannot understand or identify them. And this really underscores for that system the complexity of the auditory processing. But what we're interested in, so that can happen. Visual agnosia can happen when there's damage to the occipital lobe. Auditory agnosia can happen when there's damage to the left temporal or left prefrontal cortex. And then there's tactile agnosia, stereoagnosia, that pertains to our inability to recognize objects by touch alone. And patients can physically feel an object, but can't discern its identity or its purpose. So, for example, you'd put a cup or a dime in someone's hand, and instead of saying, yep, that's a dime or that's a cup, they would say, no, that's a hubcap or that's a wrench. And this impairment really underscores the critical role of the somatosensory cortex in processing tactile information and forming meaningful perceptions. Now, there's also kind of a subtype of tactile agnosia that is called finger agnosia. And in these cases, individuals can recognize their own fingers by they cannot recognize their own fingers by touch alone. And so this seemingly simple task becomes challenging due to the disruptions of the brain's representation of the body and the body parts. So that's just something I want you to kind of be mindful of. And each type of agnosia, though, really kind of highlights the remarkable specificity and complexity of the brain's processing of sensory information. But for our purposes here, we're interested in tactile agnosia. Now, I want to shift a little bit to focus of ataxia. And ataxia is different from agnosia because it's more about coordination. And so we have our somatosensory system that gives us information, but when we go to move our bodies, there can be disruption. And this has to do more with disruption with the cerebellum. So while ataxia primarily pertains to motor functions, it's very closely related to our discussion, I think, on somatosensory disorders, as sensory feedback plays a critical role in us maintaining our coordination. So what is ataxia? Well, ataxia is essentially a neurological disorder that's characterized by the impairment of voluntary muscle coordination. It can affect various body parts, including those required for walking or speech or fine motor tasks like writing or buttoning a shirt. And individuals with ataxia often exhibit unsteady and uncoordinated movements, which lead to difficulties in maintaining balance and performing precise actions. So ataxia can have various underlying causes, and understanding these etiological factors is essential for us to kind of appreciate how the brain functions. The first primary cause of ataxia, as I've already mentioned, is this damage to the cerebellum, because, if you recall, the cerebellum is the region of the base of the brain, that little brain, that plays a central role in coordinating motor movements. So damage to the cerebellum, whether due to an injury or stroke or a degenerative condition like spinocerebellar ataxia, can lead to ataxic symptoms. You can also have peripheral neuropathy, so disorders that affect the peripheral nerves, such as diabetic neuropathy, can result in sensory disturbances and then therefore ataxia. So sensory feedback from the limbs really is essential for maintaining your balance and coordination. Now, probably the easiest way to kind of think of ataxia is someone that's drank too much alcohol or consumed some kind of toxin. Someone that has chronically consuming alcohol can develop, for not just a drunk person, but someone that has used for a long period of time and is currently doesn't have any alcohol in the system can damage their cerebellum and cause ataxia, so they kind of walk like a drunk person. And this type of ataxia is, well, in the case of intoxication, for example, is obviously reversible because when the alcohol works out of the system, but in the other case, oftentimes is not reversible. And then, of course, there can be genetic factors that play into this. Specific gene mutations can lead to hereditary ataxia, where there's progressive coordination problems. Things like multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune disorder that can damage the central nervous system, can often damage the cerebellum. Traumatic brain injury is another cause for ataxia in some cases. So I just wanted to kind of highlight there that the sensory motor disorders and somatosensory disorders can kind of link together sometimes, particularly in something like ataxia. So one of the most significant advancements in ataxia research has been the identification of numerous genetic mutations associated with hereditary ataxia. And here researchers have pinpointed specific genes responsible for various forms of inherited ataxia. There's something called Friedreich's ataxia or cerebellar ataxias. And all of this knowledge really kind of helps us to understand a little bit more about the causes and possible treatments for it. Now, what we is clear about is that this is another part of the brain that really kind of plays a significant role in our embodied being. So as we conclude our lecture on somatosensory disorders for this week and this part of our lecture, we've talked about agnosia and ataxia. Agnosia impacting primarily on the parietal lobe, and ataxia impacting primarily on the cerebellum. The agnosia, remember, is that family of disorders that's characterized with an inability to recognize or interpret sensory stimuli accurately. So, despite there being an intact sensory pathways, there is the inability to create an accurate perception of it or interpretation of it. And that can happen to most any of the senses. So there can be visual object agnosia, there can be auditory agnosia. But in the cases that we talked about, we're kind of focusing in on tactile agnosia and a subset of that, finger agnosia. The other things that we talked about were somatic marker hypothesis of Antonio Damasio, the idea that bodily sensations help to guide our decision-making processes, and ataxia, the idea of impairment on voluntary muscle coordination, leading to an unsteady and uncoordinated movement. So that's something that typically is associated with cerebellar damage, but sometimes with peripheral neuropathy and sometimes genetic mutations that impact the cerebellar function. So that's it for our lecture for this week. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next week. You take care. Bye-bye.